As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm seated with Paul, Tanya, and Martin. Today we're going to talk about leading classroom discussions, being that great discussion producing teacher that we all kind of see in movies. It makes you, gives a romantic vision of the teaching life that is probably maybe an illusion. But we're going to get there after I ask you all a question. I'm kind of curious, Paul, when you're deciding your next book, what are some of the ways that you choose what you're going to read next?
Mostly it's feeling.
Yeah.
I just, I've got this whole wall of books, and when I finish one, I go and I look and I say, what strikes me?
Are there certain things that influence what's striking you? Is it like a mood that you're in? If you, have been reading a particular era, or is if someone in conversation mentioned, what are the kinds of things that influence your mood, do you think?
One of them is, do I have somebody who gave me this book that keeps asking me if I've read it?
Sure.
Mitchell's doing that to me on a book, currently on 2 books. And I'm doing that back to him on a couple of books. So we're going back and forth on that.
Your accountability buddies.
That's right. On what we're reading. Sometimes it also has to do with what else is going on in my life. So if I'm really busy, I'll choose a lighter book because then it's something that I look forward to and will keep me reading. If I don't have a lot going on and I know I'm going to have time to sit down and dedicate to it, I've got a whole book on silence. And every once in a while, when I feel like I'm rushing too much, I'll pull that out and I'll read a little bit of that.
But it's not the book called Silence, right?
No. I forget. I think it's called The World of Silence. I got it from 8th Day Books at a conference once. And I was like, I think I need this. And it's very good. It's short little chapters on different aspects of silence. So it's just, I'm trying to listen to the different things going on in my life about what do I need? How do I fill my soul at this time with what I'm reading? And sometimes I dig into a book and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm getting into, but it kind of strikes me. So we'll see,
I've probably mentioned it a few times on this podcast, but I really like to follow the voices of particular authors that I appreciate. And so I'll read a lot of books by the same author, and then I'll read the people that influenced them. That's one way that I kind of end up following the rabbit trail of books. Tanya, what about you? How do you choose what you're going to read next?
I do all of those things. Yeah. And really, it does a lot depend on what else is going on in my work life. If it, like in the summer, I find it very difficult to read difficult things, but I try to discipline myself to always be reading something difficult. But then, there's that call of the British murder mystery that never goes away.
It's irresistible.
Yes, it is irresistible. But I also will go down a rabbit trail with an author and try to read everything that author wrote.
Yeah.
I've been on that rabbit trail for
with
a
Graham
long
Greene.
Time. Yes.
Martin, what about you?
I it's interesting. I don't do that at all in terms of finding an author and reading I want to be able to enjoy that author for a long, long time.
You do. Where you would get me started on a series and I would speed through it and get way ahead of you because you're like, I'm going to savor this, save some for my retirement.
Well, this also explains why we don't hang out very often. It's that you want to enjoy my company longer.
Oh,
we don't want to wear it out too quickly.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering about that.
That's why I appreciate your thoughtfulness there.
Yeah. But I've mentioned before, I have my list of all the books I want to read before I die. So mostly my reading is dictated by what I have to read for work because I have to read a lot for work.
That does dictate a lot of what we read.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of books I have to read. I'm going to read Monsignor Quixote because Paul wants to read it for our book group in March. And so that's going to take up some time, but I'm usually just I want to make sure I get certain things read, and I have my long list with a lot of them are bolded, which is the really important ones I really need to read.
It kind of strikes me that your list of books that you want to read before you die is somewhat existential. That when you reach the end of that list, it's going to be a really dark day for you.
Well, it's a really long list. I mean, I'm
pray that you never reach the end of it.
But you read a lot.
I do read.
I mean, I don't know that it would take you too terribly long. I mean, I don't know how long this list is, but if you had all day, every day to read, I'd be curious. I'd be curious how long that would take you.
Yeah, I don't know, and I have a house closer to the office now, and so I don't get as much time reading on the road as I used to, and I realized how much that has cost me actually. So I feel this greater obligation to read.
Yeah, it's I find that some of the books that I'm forced to read for my job, I truly enjoy, and others feel like an obligation. And when I'm reading a book that feels like an obligation, I feel like I need to add in a British murder mystery so that I can have enjoyment in reading.
And I try to work it to where the books I have to read are the books I really want to read.
Well, but there are
books, there are books, those books that they're books that you would really like if you read them, but you just don't have an excuse to read them. So like an example for me just recently would be Pride and Prejudice.
Right.
Now, I think I'm still not sure whether I read it or not, a long time ago, but I don't think I read it recently, because when I read it recently, I realized I really hadn't, if in the last 20, 30 years anyway. And so, but it was welcome. It was a welcome obligation to have to read
That's
that
right.
book.
Sure. I am really enjoying my return to Jane Austen.
Yeah. Give us a Mansfield Park update.
I'm really enjoying it.
So Lita won you over.
I am really enjoying it very. She has won me over.
Wow.
Now we'll see by the end. But I do think it matters how, what time of life you read it. And
Absolutely.
I read it at a time of life when I just couldn't enjoy Fanny at all. I was frustrated with her. I, as a young person, was putting myself in her place and thinking, well, this is just ridiculous. She just needs to put herself out there.
Yeah.
And now I can read with empathy.
Sure.
For her and who she is, and an understanding more about the time period. And, it's just wasted on the young.
Yeah, I often wonder if we should, because what you want to do on books like this is you kind of want to say, well, we shouldn't read these books early because you really can't appreciate them like you appreciate them later in life. But I really don't think that's true. I just think that you appreciate them differently for that reason. I mean, it's not that you can't appreciate them earlier. It's just that you appreciate them in a different way because of what experience you're now bringing to it.
And probably that early experience with the book that wasn't as good as some of the others is making it different this second time as well.
Yes.
So it's another reason why I wouldn't ever discourage someone from reading a great book when they're young.
That's right. Oh, no, I wouldn't discourage it either. But I certainly related much better to Emma than I did at that point in my life to Fanny Price. But it was still Jane Austen.
Right,
it was still a good read. I just didn't particularly like that character because I didn't understand her.
That was like me with Lord of the Rings. I tried to read Lord of the Rings when I was
too young,
7th or 8th grade maybe. Mm-hmm. And because I wasn't paying attention very carefully to every name, I would just look at it and be like, I know kind of who Bilbo is, but like I didn't really sound it out. And by the time I got halfway through the 3rd book, I was totally lost. Couldn't understand a word of it because he's got so many names that are so similar that I just put it down. And then finally I had somebody just like rake me over the coals for it. And like at the end of high school, like, you stopped halfway through the 3rd book. And so then I went back and reread it. And it was, I loved
experience.
It, but it was a different experience.
Yeah.
But I think the thing for me is not just, I always have books to read. I need the security of knowing that my bookshelf has too many books on it that I haven't read. If I ever thought I was like my bookshelf was down to like 3 books that I haven't read, I would be in a panic, rushing off to a local bookstore to replenish it because I have some kind of insecurity about running out of reading material.
Yeah. Well, it's very possible in the day of Amazon, and
that I can have a book in 24 hours.
But I struggle with when I'm going to go on a road trip and I'm looking for a book to listen to, or That's the particular thing, because if I need a book to sit down and read, I have plenty on my shelf and I don't need to go look for one. But if I'm going to go look for an audiobook, I struggle to find one that's not in the canon that I know I'm going to like, if that makes sense. So like I can't go through the top picks and hope to find something good.
That's true.
And it's sort of infuriating to me, because so whenever I do find a book that I'm like, ooh, that's good, I buy it right then. So then that way I have a running list.
Right.
But like that idea of running out and trying to find a book, every time I try to do that, I end up unhappy.
That's like when you're trying to find the perfect dress. It just happens to be.
I have not had that experience.
It just happens to, like, there are beautiful dresses, but then when you really need one for a wedding, can't find it.
The analogy is that we're concerned that we're going to run out of clothes at some point, and that would be a really terrible experience.
Or just the right clothes.
It might be as terrible as not having a book.
Yeah, right. On that note, today's episode is a follow-up to a previous conversation about Socratic questioning, where we talked about that term specifically and just what it actually means. And I think we kind of landed on a place of saying there's a lot of intention behind that term that is noteworthy, but it's worth kind of analyzing what people mean by it. We didn't necessarily take the second step of suggesting, how do you actually have great classroom discussions, especially in high school classes or college classes, where you want to bring the students out of their shells to engage with the material that you're covering and that you're talking about. So today's episode is about how can we lead great classroom conversations, and what do teachers need to do to prepare themselves for that classroom experience. So Tanya, I'll kick it to you. Cheryl actually had some thoughts on what kinds of questions, instead of just saying, you should be a Socratic questioner, she actually said, here are the questions that you can ask. And then I think from there we can nuance, what ages are these appropriate for? How does a teacher get prepared to ask these kinds of questions? And I think that could be helpful for someone thinking about a literature class or history class or a theology class.
Yes, and I appreciate you throwing it to me, but I would like to throw it to Paul, because Cheryl had a real conversation with Paul about this and about the 4 types of questions, and she made him speak about it once. And so I really feel like he should probably be the one to give the introduction to this, and then I will kick in whenever.
Well, so I loved the fact that she wanted to make a distinction on the kinds of questions, because that's a distinction that's not often made. And so, if you were to walk into a Highlands classroom, you would see, especially in grade school years, but I mean, I used it in middle school and high school, where you start the class out just asking very discrete kind of questions, right? Where the student can give you a very quick response, and that can be done for review. That can be done, at the end of a lesson, where you're just trying to make sure they've gotten everything. But we talked about in the Socratic conversation, Martin made that point where you have people get up to talk about how good Socratic questioning is, but they didactically lecture it to you, right? And I think talking about this kind of question is saying there are questions that you can engage the student very, very quickly, and not spend time, but you're asking something like, when was Rome founded? Who founded Rome? Those kinds of questions, because you're going to get an immediate response. So rapid fire kind of things. And then you've got sort of evaluative questions. So you need to know what the students know. And so you might not actually know that they can give this back to you right away. So that's kind of at the end of your lesson, you might do something more like that, where it's a review, and it may not be as rapid fire. They might be just as discrete, but they're going to be questions of, what.
This could be like after they've read a chapter at home, and you're getting ready to have a discussion, and you just want to make sure that they've read it. So it would be like really basic questions about that. Or if you have just done, say, a famous Men of Rome lesson, and you just want to make sure that they were listening, engaged, and that they got it. So the questions, I think, would be less rapid fire and more like, can anybody tell me what happened when Adam of the Road brought the war horse out to the other boys that weren't nice to him? Or
can I ask a clarifying question? So the first type of question was rapid fire, and that's about facts.
Yes.
The second kind of question is evaluative. Is it an evaluation the student is making or that the teacher is making?
No, I think the teacher making an evaluation of what the student knows. Okay. So, for example, you might use a rapid fire question at the beginning of a Latin class, which is, what are the 5 cases? Knowledge, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, right? But the first time you teach that content, at the end of the lesson, at the end of teaching that, you might say, who can tell me the names of the 5 cases?
Right.
And that's kind of, you're asking the same question, but in different scenarios and for different purposes.
And really the first kind of rapid fire drill question that's the material that we really want students to master. Mm-hmm. And the second kind of question is more, we just want to make sure that they're getting what we're teaching. Mm-hmm. So it is really the first kind of question is about memory.
Sure. What are the third and fourth types of questions, Paul?
So then the third kind of question would be where you are, through a series of questions, leading students to some sort of discovery. And it's what she didn't like the term discovery learning,
right,
in the sense of just kind of send the students out and let them go find something to learn. But she was like, the real discovery learning is where you're questioning them in the same way in the Meno, right, with the slave boy, questioning him to the point where he's like, oh, that has to be true because I just walked through this logical process.
The light bulb comes on.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so that you have to really prepare for and know how you're going to lead them. And you also have to know when they go off the rails, you have to know how to lead them back to what you're trying to get them to. And so, I mean, math teachers do this all the time, right?
Latin, you would do it in Latin too.
Yeah. And okay, what's our next step in this process? And helping them figure out that pattern of that thought where they're going to end up to solving the equation or coming up with a translation, whatever that be. And then the fourth one is more, I would call more value-based questions, where you call them discussion questions, where we're talking about the value, where we kind of Martin ended on in the Socratic Questions podcast, where you talked about with Socratic question, we're really talking about values and what is justice, how ought we to live justice, that sort of thing. And so those are much more broad, much more open-ended, take a whole lot of time, and need to be even more carefully planned than your ones where you're trying to lead them to a discovery.
Martin, I have a question for you about these 4 types of questions, but before I ask it, let's take a quick break. On your mark, get set, go live. Classical Etc. is hitting the road and going live at the Great Homeschool Convention in Cincinnati, Ohio this coming April. We'll be there with the rest of the Memoria Press team to meet with you, answer your questions, and come together at this table for a live taping of Classical Etc. Join us in Cincinnati April 13th through 15th at the Great Homeschool Convention. Follow the link in the description to learn more. Hope to see you there. Martin, we've talked about rapid fire questions, evaluative questions, questions that are leading, and then questions about values or themes. Is there any guidance you could offer teachers about the appropriateness of these questions for different age levels, grade levels? How should teachers think about when to utilize these kinds of questions?
Well, I think the first couple are really for younger children. I mean, it's just a means of getting the knowledge in their heads, and you are asking leading questions. Cheryl used to, and I can't remember the exact expression she used when she was talking about discovery learning of the kind that progressive educators are always talking about, which she characterized as giving children knowledge by withholding it from them. But if you think about it, there's a way you could sort of describe what we're talking about here is doing that, because you're presumably they've had something that is informing them of what they're supposed to know. And you're just trying to get them to express that in a way where they kind of embrace the knowledge.
And probably connect the dots.
And connect the dots. Having to say something yourself, expressing it back is a helpful tool in learning. And so part of the reason for doing some of that kind of early stuff is so that they will do that. So they now have to articulate it, which means they have to think about it again and think about it in an opposite direction from when it was incoming. So I think that's important. That's something you're doing with a lot of younger children. You can even do that on math facts. Obviously, Johnny, what's 2 + 3? This sort of thing, which is a very different thing than when you're asking them to evaluate something that they already know. And I think because I think those are two very different ways of using question and answers. Because I was thinking when I found out what we're going to be talking about in this program, I was thinking about some of the discussions we have over at Dan Scheffler's house about once a month,
where I've never been invited.
Yeah, I'll talk to you about that later. Where we
I'm sure you will.
Where the level of the discussions is extremely high, and so I think after you talk about using questions to help somebody to gain knowledge, once you have the knowledge and you're assessing it, the best way to do that is in community with somebody. And so what you're trying to do in the classroom is a very different situation than Dan's living room.
You're right.
Okay, that's we do that. These are very mature,
trained
people who are doing this. They've directed these things before, and maybe to a certain extent in your own classroom. There's only a certain extent to which you can do this in a classroom.
For one thing, they don't have the knowledge that they need to be able to make good arguments.
They don't.
And you don't want them arguing. You don't want young children arguing with each other over things they're not ready to argue over. That's why it has to be teacher directed.
Right. Although the older they get, I mean, you can find yourself in a high school situation.
High school,
where
definitely.
Somebody says, I don't understand why so-and-so did thus and such. And some other student, that kind of piques them. So they say, well, I mean, he's trying to do X, and so then the teacher is this is what you
becomes the moderator
want them to do. The teacher becomes moderator, and then what so-and-so said, actually it sounds kind of funny, but think about it for a minute, and so you're helping to now cultivate something that's already going on in the classroom, because there's enough maturity there to where you can have a decent discussion, and that's something that kids will latch on to. When there's an argument in the class between two students, if you can ever get to that point, everybody's engaged in it. Every mind in that classroom is focused on what's going on right now. And so but you're still always, and this is the difference I have with a lot of people who talk about Socratic discussion in classical education, that the teacher always has to be in control of the situation and know where things are going and stop it from going here and pushing it to go over there and this sort of thing. And that not only takes training on the part of the students, it takes training on the part of the instructor.
And a lot of forethought and preparation.
That's right.
But for the younger students, we can get there, but we just have to do it in a different way. Sure. So I used an example earlier from Adam of the Road, so I'm just going to continue that one. So Adam wants nothing more than to be a minstrel like his father. He wants to be on the road. He wants to be outside in nature, not crammed into a classroom like his best friend Perkin, who's thrilled to be at Oxford studying. And so you can put on the board the pros of being a minstrel, the pros of being a student in a classroom in Oxford. And students can express their opinions by giving you that list of pros and then cons of each. And so you're training them to think about, they have preferences and the things that would be good or bad, but we're doing it in a way that diffuses any kind of disagreement. They will be in disagreement some. It will be, we're not saying they can't have opinions and that we're feeding them everything, but we have to do it in a controlled way that makes good sense. Rather than if you just threw out the question, who wants to be a minstrel? Who wants to be, then you're not really accomplishing anything. But if you actually write down the pros and cons, you can see that there are pros to both and there are cons to both.
Yeah. And one thing I'd like to point out that occurred to me as Martin was talking about the discussions at Dan's house is...
Have you been invited?
I have been invited.
They used to happen, Shane?
They used to happen at my house, Tanya, actually. So if you did it at your house, we might all show up.
Oh, there is a scary thought.
By having questioning as sort of a default mode in the classroom. So, in middle school, I love doing this where a student would raise their hand and say, well, Mr. Schaefer, why did Patroclus take Achilles' armor? Well, why do you think he did it? Right? Like, what in the text would get in your default mode is to ask it back. You're modeling for them that this, in some sense, is a way of humility, a way of always being willing to question and always being willing to say, I don't know, what do you think about that? And so that modeling, because in those conversations at Dan's house, it's not a bunch of people shouting at each other, but oftentimes people will say,
although it can sound like that sometimes.
It can sometimes, but what will happen is somebody will say, well, this is what this author says over here. And then somebody else will say, but if that author's saying that, well, what about this other thing? And not everybody shouting at each other, but posing questions. There's a lot of question posing one to another rather than just people shouting at each other. So we're modeling as a teacher by always asking questions, by making that something that happens in every single classroom, every single class period. We are teaching them not to be really rigid in their thought, but always being willing to question and say, well, what about this other thing? What about this other thing?
Right. Is Achilles a hero or a wimp? I mean, there are just all kinds of things that we can deal with that get beyond the rapid fire. This is the information we want you to master.
Yeah. And this strikes me anytime I go into a classroom here at Highlands is you go into even a lower school classroom and the teacher is always asking questions. It's just they're different kinds of questions for a different purpose.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're articulating is that our teachers need to be conscious of the level of the kind of question that they're asking and the suitability of that question for the subject that they're teaching. So building on that, what do you think teachers can do practically? What would you be saying to teachers when you're coaching them? And I'm thinking specifically now of high school humanities teachers, essentially, to have good discussion. What do they need to be doing during the week to prepare for those great discussions as they're lesson planning or, in our words, learning the curriculum that they're going to be presenting?
I think the first thing is to really know the material and to have those essential questions. What are the essential questions for whatever text you're studying that we want to lead students to? So it's basically you need to know the answer to that. What are the questions that you want? When you read the Odyssey, is the journey the main thing about it? What is it that you want students to know? Essential questions, and then be able to hopefully have the conversation to lead them there. But I've been in classrooms too, and I taught 5th and 6th grades, not high school, where one of my students would say something that I had never even considered before. So also the other thing is you have to be prepared, but not rigid.
Right.
You have to be prepared for students to say things that are going to turn a light bulb on for you. Especially in high school, because those students are ready to
especially
go.
With great books, like you say, teaching in high school, the students will notice things that you did not notice, and it's good. And even when it's something you have noticed, and a student says something that you haven't made the observation, the student makes the observation, and maybe it's one you were going to make, or maybe it's one you've never heard before, and you said, "Okay, that's interesting. Explain that." Or what does everybody else think about what he just said? Did anybody else notice this? That's when people are really engaged in in what's going on.
Well, and those techniques you just use give you time to formulate what do I want to think about this and how do I want to lead them on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it catches you by surprise, as much as you've prepared, by throwing it back to them gives you a chance to go, is this going in a direction that I need to steer them away from?
Yes.
Is this worth trumping what I had prepared?
Mm-hmm.
If not, I need to redirect them and say, okay, that's interesting. Great. Let's tie that in a bow. Let's move back to this.
And I remember this when we first started the online school. It was, I think, was around 2003, 2005, somewhere. Right. We did not have
the internet back then.
Huh? But yeah, it was the Stone Age of era of the.
It was all chat.
It was text chat. We had to use text chat. Can you imagine? But the thing is that even when the video came in, we went then to video. Something was lost. Very interesting. A different technology comes in. It was there was something that was going on in the text chat. I never fully explained to myself what it was. But what I later then decided to do a couple of years after I was using the video now is we went back to text chat for discussion of literature, and I called it the Socratic session. And they thought this is really advanced stuff. No, it's the primitive technology we're going to use here. And so and you're seeing these posts come down, and if you've got that can be kind of confusing, so you really have to pay attention. But some student there's always some student who'd make some observation. Say, oh, whoa, wait a minute. Everybody look at what Joseph said here. What do you think of that? And it sort of enabled me to do that better, and
it enabled them to, because they'll speak
to focus because it's still right there. They can still read it right there,
and they'll speak by text, whereas they may not want to.
Yes,
yes.
It was the different technology created a very different discussion environment.
That's interesting.
In many ways, it was better. Very, very interesting.
You should consider going back to that at the MPOA.
Yeah, your advanced online program.
Turn those cameras off.
Maybe we will.
I would like to ask a question, which
hear it.
I didn't ask before. I am a little confused about the difference between the third type of question and the fourth type of question.
So, Paul, first, the third type of question is a leading question, right?
Mm-hmm.
I use it, and the fourth question is about values.
That's the way I would characterize it. Yes.
So the third one, you're still imparting information to them, but the fourth one, you're asking them to impart. It's kind of like the rhetoric.
It's right. That's the distinction I would make between those two. So that third sort of discovery learning one, the responses you're going to get from a student are probably going to be one sentence or less.
And they are responses that you're expecting.
That's correct, because you've formulated that question in a way that there's really only one. You're taking
leading
just that
them to an end point.
Between every question. You're just taking that minuscule step forward in whatever you're trying to lead them towards. So there's no real way for them to go off kilter, except to look at you like a deer in the headlights and go, I don't know. Then you pivot to the next student. Whereas the fourth one, the discussion questions, those are more going to be these great ideas kinds of questions, which allows students to push and pull a little bit more about, well, what does this mean? What of it?
So you're really not going to use that except for high school? You could use number 3, and you're going to introduce things like justice and mercy or whatever. You're going to introduce them, but you're really leading them very definitely toward
right. And I mean, I did it a little bit like with the Iliad and the Odyssey in 7th and 8th grade, but I made sure I kind of kept that. I mean, we're talking 5 minutes. Would keep the rails on fairly well. And then as those kids get older, they had more and more time for that.
Well, there's also a difference between, like, when I'm teaching literature, and we're doing some sort of plot analysis or something, and I use a plot diagram. I have certain questions. What do we put here? What do we put here? What do we put here? I think that's sort of the third question more. But then when you ask, why did so-and-so do thus and such? Then you've stepped, I think, to the fourth question, if I'm not mistaken.
It seems like you're hitting at an important question about the fourth question, and that is, what are we trying to achieve? Is it understanding of something they didn't understand before? Is it a connection to their life? What is the purpose or goal of this discussion of thematic elements in literature or theology or history?
That's a question you're asking.
I am.
Well, I don't know that we can give a universal answer to that. More of in this book when I'm bringing this up, what is my purpose here for doing that? And this is a overly used example from my life, but when I realized that a student was so far off kilter on her understanding of what love was, when we were in book 4 of the Aeneid with Dido, I had to stop and say, okay, we need to spend time in class about this, because this is going to orient the way this person sees relationships. And the whole class, like everybody was on board with like, oh, it was so wonderful that Dido killed herself because her, because Aeneas ran off. No, it's not wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about what love is. And so I had a very particular goal in that class. Was I wanted to bust him of it. And, Martin has brought in, you talk about the Flannery O'Connor short stories you brought in to knock those kids out of their cynicism, right? Mm-hmm. Like you will see in your class sometimes a very particular thing that you want to hammer. And then that's going to define your purpose of why you're bringing these questions up.
But I think universally, I think it really comes down to teaching them how to think. And hopefully we've done that. And that this then is, before we send them off to college, this would be our way of controlling that in the classroom, but also giving them the opportunity to express themselves and to really start thinking about those things that they need to think about, like what is God's purpose for their lives and how do they achieve it, and what is justice? What does that mean? And how can they be ethical people? So I think all of that, you don't think so?
The finishing touches on teaching students how to think and not what to think.
Yeah, right? Well, and as you said that, I thought, well, maybe this is actually one of the key ways in which we're actually freeing the students, right? We're freeing them in the liberal art sense. We're freeing them from societal tropes and just ways of thinking, and teaching them to think more broadly and to question things, and in the sense of question the great ideas and not just assume, oh, justice is this or love is this.
Because nothing's black and white like that. Yeah. And that's why we end with apologetics. Our seniors take an apologetics course.
Well, the way I think about this is one of the things the first thing you're doing is trying to figure out what the author is saying. Okay, that involves like how the story's structured, what they said and why they said it, and all this stuff. And the last thing is what you think about what the author said. And you cannot do that until you've established that first thing. You got to understand what the author's saying. Paul brought up Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor is the most sophisticated writer I have ever read. And what she's saying is buried so far down that you could spend the whole time just talking about what she's saying and the weird way in which she said it. And if you could just get there, then you've accomplished something. So I have found in discussions of Flannery O'Connor stories that you don't spend as much time on what you think about what she said, because you're still so
trying to figure out. She stunned
you with what she actually said.
And once you get to what she said, you basically just have to say, okay, I'll take it.
Right. But with most authors, you are talking about they're saying something and they're saying it in a particular way, and you talk about, because we really haven't talked about like structural elements in a piece of literature. That's a very different, doing the plot diagram and all that stuff and how they did that. And that's getting into deeply the skill of the author in doing what they've done and saying what they're saying. But even when you're just trying to lead kids in that what I would call, I guess, the third step, you're just leading kids to understanding what in fact they said, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's as far as you can get. And then with the older students, then you can go to that fourth step of saying, well, what do we think of them? Are they right?
Right.
Are they wrong?
It appears as though you could summarize everything that you guys are saying as don't attempt to achieve that final fourth question too quickly. It needs to be earned, and that we have to lay a groundwork, and it's not because we're telling our students what to think necessarily. We're building towards teaching them how to think. And that takes the memorization of facts and more direct.
And I think that really is the lesson. And I think even in high school classes, sometimes even advanced high school classes, if you've got an advanced author like a Flannery O'Connor or something like that, sometimes that's all you want to get out of that. The why and whether this is a good message or whatever it is not, they're not even ready for that yet, maybe with that particular author.
We do read a lot of things that they're really not ready, like Augustine. They're really not fully ready, but hopefully they will one day return to those things and be fully ready. We're building a foundation.
Yeah. And I think, Shane, what you said bears repeating, that, when a teacher hears you should use questioning in your classroom, they don't need to jump to the fourth one. Right. There's so many,
which is the tendency.
That is the tendency. And there are so many other kinds of questions you can ask that are going to pay dividends rather than trying to jump to something the students aren't prepared for.
Let's end on this. Y'all have many collective years of teaching experience between you. Is there any memorable light bulb moments, either for a student or for yourself in a classroom situation, that you could share with our audience? A time where you were in a discussion and a student noticed something that was profound to them, or you saw the light bulb go on for them or for yourself, that shows the fruit of this kind of discussion?
Without hopefully getting too far in the weeds, when I was teaching the classical philosophy course at Highlands, we were talking about essential differences and accidental differences, and I had a student put together, if we're talking about qualities and differences, and some are according to their essence and some are just accidental, meaning that aren't part of their essence. She raised her hand. She said, "Mr. Schaefer, is gender accidental or essential?" And I mean, that question came out of nowhere, but what she was trying to do was take what she was learning and apply that to questions that she was being confronted with, as she was becoming an adult. And I looked at her and I said, "You don't have the philosophical tools to answer that question right now." But I said, when we get there, we can circle back. And we did. We circled back for a very short time. I said, this question, I can't deny. I mean, these were juniors. Like we were almost out of it. Like, I can't deny that that's a valid question based on what we're learning. But she was able to put it together, and I was hoping they weren't going to put that together at that point, right? And so we ended up having a great, fruitful conversation later on. But I also had to say, hold that.
Not yet.
Hold that.
Not yet.
Yeah. I mean, she had to hold it for like 4 or 5 months before she had the tools.
Well, Paul referred to this earlier. I had this class of very cynical seniors. It was just, all classes.
My son was in there.
He was. And they were just so cynical about everything. Nothing was capturing them. Nothing. I mean, we were doing some great stuff. So I had a couple weeks really that I could do something with. And so we read Flannery O'Connor's Good Country People, which is the story about the traveling Bible salesman who steals the lady's wooden leg. and if you've ever read Flannery O'Connor, she'll just numb you with her these incredible underlying metaphysical insights in these preposterous stories.
Preposterous.
They're
that's
preposterous.
Good.
And it's like they just fastened onto this story that finally there was something that they couldn't easily understand, because they were all very intelligent, that they couldn't easily understand and just process doing their usual thing. They had to deal with this. And so we spent 2 weeks on this. That's the one I remember. I just had to deal with the cynicism somehow, and I used Flannery O'Connor to just explode the whole thing. So, yeah.
Do you have anything?
Mine is a failure on my behalf.
Oh, interesting.
When the first time I taught the door in the wall, I didn't tell my students that it didn't end perfectly, and I didn't lead them in the way that I would have if I had followed this. I should have been leading them toward the fact that everybody has a purpose in life and that no life is perfect. And they were just devastated that he didn't walk at the end of his life or at the end of the book, even though he became the hero of the town. He saves the town. He finds his door in the wall. But I learned after that, that you really do, these were fifth graders, you really do have to lead them toward what you want them to get. And I didn't, I just kept saying, I'm not going to tell you the end of the book. Well, that was a mistake. I mean, I didn't tell them the end of the book from then on, but I was certainly leading them toward, after that year, leading them toward the real purpose of the book. And I really failed that first year students.
So for all the teachers listening, failing and then learning how to do better the next year, that's a big part of it.
It is. You have to lead, you have to guide them. Because all they're seeing is a crippled boy that they want healed. And they didn't see beyond that, and I needed to help them get there.
Sounds like a great discussion, though, eventually.
Yes.
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below, and if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.